Right now, somewhere in your body, something hurts. Maybe not dramatically, maybe not in a way that has a name or a diagnosis or a conversation attached to it. Maybe just the low, persistent, easily ignored hum of a body that has been doing too much or resting too little, or carrying something it hasn't put down in a long time. Maybe it's older than that, a hurt that arrived years ago and never fully left, that you have learned to live alongside the way you learn to live alongside background noise until you forget it's there. But it's there, and somewhere beneath the management of it, beneath the strategies you have developed for not feeling it too acutely, there is a question you have probably never allowed yourself to ask directly. What if the pain is not the problem? Not the physical pain, not the emotional pain, both, all of it. The specific, recurring, deeply unwanted signal that your nervous system generates when the gap between what your body and mind are being asked to do and what they are currently capable of doing becomes too large to ignore. The signal that most of modern life is organized in one way or another to reduce, to medicate, to distract, to explain, to manage, to process, to eliminate. What if the signal is not the enemy? What if the signal is, in some precise and scientifically serious sense, the information? Two men have spent significant portions of their lives pressing into this question from completely different directions. One of them came to it through a laboratory, through the meticulous, peer-reviewed, rigorously documented science of how the brain generates and responds to stress, pain, fear, and the chemical cascades that determine whether a human being is broken by difficulty or built by it. The other came to it through a life, through a childhood of such concentrated cruelty and deprivation that most psychological frameworks would have predicted a person destroyed rather than the one who emerged. Through a body pushed so far past every reasonable limit that the pushing itself became the method. Andrew Huberman, neuroscientist, Stanford professor. A man who has spent decades in the laboratory studying how the nervous system processes stress and how deliberate engagement with discomfort produces measurable, reproducible biological changes in the brain. David Goggins, former Navy SEAL, ultramarathon runner. A man who grew up with an abusive father in a household of such darkness that he spent years hiding in the bathroom, waiting for the violence to pass. Who was obese at 24. Who passed the Navy SEAL qualification program 3 times, the last time on a stress fracture both legs. Who ran a 100-mile race with no training and finished it on 2 broken feet, leaving parts of his feet inside his shoes. They are not saying the same thing, but they are pointing at the same thing. Something that mainstream culture has gotten profoundly wrong about suffering. Not wrong in the sense that suffering is secretly good and we should stop trying to reduce it. Not wrong in the way of the person who has confused endurance with virtue and believes that suffering is its own justification. Something more precise and more uncomfortable than either of these. Wrong about what suffering is for. Wrong about what the signal means. Wrong about what happens in the brain, in the body, in the psychological structure of the person when the signal is consistently silenced rather than heard. When the difficulty is consistently avoided rather than metabolized. When the gap between who you are and who you could be is managed rather than crossed. Huberman can tell you what happens in the neuroscience. He can show you the cortisol curves and the dopamine dynamics and the neuroplasticity research that documents, with the precision of measurement, what consistent avoidance of discomfort does to the brain over time. He can show you the studies on stress inoculation and the research on deliberate cold exposure and the literature on what voluntary, controlled, purposive engagement with difficulty does to the nervous system at the cellular level. Goggins cannot show you any of that. What he can show you is the lived version of the same truth. What he can give you is the first-person account of a person who has been so far into the territory that the scientific description, however precise, does not fully capture what happens there. Who knows from the inside what the research describes from the outside? Whose life is in a sense a 70-year experiment in what the human organism is actually capable of when it decides to stop negotiating with its own limitations. Together, in their different languages, from their different directions, they are describing something that is among the most important and most systematically misunderstood features of human existence. The relationship between suffering and growth is not metaphorical. It is biological. It is written into the architecture of the nervous system with the same precision and the same inevitability with which the architecture of the body responds to physical training. The muscle does not grow in the comfort of rest. It grows in the controlled, purposive, specific disruption of the rest, in the damage that triggers the repair that produces the strength, And the nervous system, the brain, the psychological structure, the capacity for endurance and resilience, and the specific quality that Goggins calls the calloused mind, operates by the same principle. You do not get stronger by avoiding what challenges you. You get weaker in exactly the dimension that the avoidance protects. But here's the strange part. This is not an argument for masochism, not an argument for the romanticism of suffering, not the claim that pain is good and you should seek it. The science is more precise than that. The distinction that both Huberman and Goggins are drawing, from their different directions, in their different vocabularies, is between two fundamentally different relationships to difficulty. The suffering that destroys and the suffering that builds are not distinguished by their intensity. They are distinguished by meaning, by context, by whether the person in the difficulty has any relationship to it, any sense of what it is for, any agency in the encounter, any orientation towards the thing that the difficulty is in service of. A prisoner in solitary confinement and an ultramarathon runner at mile 80 may be experiencing comparable levels of physical and psychological distress. The difference between them, the difference that determines whether the experience builds or destroys, is not the level of the suffering. It is everything that surrounds the suffering, the meaning, the choice, the relationship to the pain. This is where the science and the life experience converge. This is where Huberman's laboratory and Goggins's broken feet are telling the same story, and the story is not comfortable. It is not the story that the modern comfort-maximizing culture has been telling itself. It is the story that the nervous system has been trying to communicate for as long as there have been nervous systems. The signal is not the enemy. The signal is the beginning of something. The question is whether you are willing to receive it. That is what we are here to find out. The word stress has been so thoroughly pathologized by modern culture that most people experience the word itself as an aversive signal. Stress is bad. Stress kills. Stress is the thing you manage, reduce, eliminate through the correct combination of mindfulness and sleep hygiene and dietary adjustments and digital boundaries and therapeutic processing. There are entire industries built on this premise, and the premise is not entirely wrong. Chronic, uncontrolled, inescapable stress, the kind that has no off-ramp, no meaning, no agency attached to it, is genuinely harmful. The research on this is solid and extensive. Sustained elevation of cortisol, the primary stress hormone, is associated with impaired immune function, cardiovascular damage, cognitive decline, disrupted sleep, and a constellation of other outcomes that justify a significant amount of the medical and psychological attention that chronic stress receives. But here is what Andrew Huberman, with the precision of a neuroscientist who has spent years in the literature, wants you to understand before you conclude anything about stress. Stress and the stress response are not the same thing. The stress response is one of the most elegant and most essential biological systems in the human organism. It is ancient, far older than the human species, conserved across evolutionary time because it works. When the nervous system detects a challenge, a threat, a demand, a gap between the current state and what the situation requires, it activates a cascade of biological events that is, in the short term, not just tolerable but genuinely enhancing. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are released. The heart rate increases, blood is redirected from the digestive system to the muscles, attention narrows and sharpens, reaction time decreases, inflammatory processes that would normally be ongoing are suppressed to free up resources for immediate action. The visual field actually widens slightly. Hearing becomes more acute. The entire system is up-regulated, moved into a higher gear, with the specific purpose of enabling the organism to meet the challenge. This is not pathology. This is preparation. The problem that Huberman identifies, and this is one of the most important and least discussed distinctions in all of stress biology, is not the stress response itself. The problem is the meta-response, the response to the response. What happens in the mind of the person who has just felt the physiological cascade of stress activation and then makes a judgment about that activation? If the judgment is, this feeling means danger, this feeling means something is wrong, this feeling is itself the problem and must be managed, reduced, escaped as quickly as possible, then something specific happens in the neurobiology. The additional layer of psychological stress generated by the resistance to the stress response compounds the original activation. The cascade continues beyond what the original stressor required. The system stays in the upregulated state not because the challenge demands it, but because the response to the response is generating its own demand. But if the judgment is different, if the physiological cascade of stress activation is received not as a signal of danger, but as a signal of preparation, of the body mobilizing its resources to meet the demand, then the neurobiological picture changes significantly. Studies by Huberman's colleague Alia Crum at Stanford have demonstrated that the belief about stress, whether a person believes that stress is harmful or that stress is enhancing, produces measurable differences in the physiological outcomes of the same objective stressor. Same challenge, same objective stress load, different belief about the stress response, different biology. Now think about this for a moment. The implications of this research go well beyond the management of workplace stress or the optimization of athletic performance. They reach into something fundamental about the relationship between mind and body and the degree to which conscious interpretation of internal states shapes those states in real time. You're not simply experiencing your nervous system. You are, in a precise biological sense, in relationship with it. The interpretation you bring to the signals your body generates is not a passive reading of objective data. It is an active intervention in the data itself. This is where Huberman's laboratory science begins to touch Goggins' lived experience in a way that is more than metaphorical. Because what Goggins discovered, not through science, through suffering, is the same principle expressed in the language of someone who had to figure it out the hard way. He did not know the cortisol curves. He did not have access to the research on stress inoculation. What he had was a childhood that had exposed him to so much uncontrolled, inescapable, genuinely damaging stresses that the stress response itself had become a familiar landscape. And somewhere in the process of deciding to change his life, of deciding to use the same capacity for suffering that his childhood had produced as the vehicle for transformation rather than destruction, he made the discovery that Huberman's laboratory would later document. The suffering is not the thing you survive. The suffering is the tool. But the tool only works when something has changed in the relationship to it, when the same physiological cascade that produces panic in one person produces focus in another, when the same pain signal that stops one person at mile 40 carries another person to mile 100, when the same darkness that breaks a mind turns, under certain conditions, into the specific hard-won resource that Goggins calls the calloused mind. But here's the strange part. The calloused mind is not the absence of feeling. This is one of the most persistent and most damaging misunderstandings of what people like Goggins represent. The performance does not come from not feeling the pain. It comes from a changed relationship to the pain, from a nervous system that has been exposed repeatedly and purposively to discomfort of increasing intensity until the discomfort has been categorized by the deep learning mechanisms of the brain as survivable, as familiar, as something that has been here before and did not kill you, and therefore does not require the full activation of the threat response. This is what neuroscientists call stress inoculation. Controlled, voluntary, purposive exposure to stressors of increasing intensity in a context that provides the meaning and the agency and the off-ramp that transforms the exposure from traumatic to developmental. The difference between trauma and training is not the level of the stress. It is the presence or absence of agency, the presence or absence of meaning, the presence or absence of the belief, demonstrated through repetition, built through experience, that the thing you are going into is something you can come through. Goggins built this from scratch, without the science, without the framework, through the raw, brutal, sometimes genuinely dangerous method of simply going further than he had gone before and surviving the going and using the survival as evidence for the next further. He called it the 40% rule, the idea, not a scientific claim in the rigorous sense, but an experiential one with significant alignment with the research on the limits of endurance, that when the mind says stop, the body is approximately 40% done with what it is actually capable of. The first stop signal is not the truth. It is the first negotiation. And what happens in the space between the first negotiation and the actual limit is where the most significant neurological, psychological, and characterological development takes place, in the gap between where you want to stop and where you actually stop. That gap is not comfortable. That gap is everything. David Goggins was not born hard. This matters. It matters because the mythology that sometimes forms around people of extraordinary endurance suggests a prior endowment, a constitutional toughness, a genetic gift, a natural capacity for suffering that ordinary people simply lack. The mythology is comfortable because it places the extraordinary person outside the range of comparison. They are different in kind, what they can do, do you cannot do, because you are not built the way they are built. The mythology is wrong. Goggins was born into poverty in Toccoa, Georgia. His father, Trunnis Goggins, ran a skating rink and managed his family the way he managed everything, through violence, fear, and total control. Nights were organized around avoiding notice, around being small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to escape the specific form of attention that meant pain. David Goggins, as a child, developed the psychological architecture that children develop when the environment is genuinely threatening and genuinely inescapable. He learned to dissociate, to be present to the surface while something deeper went elsewhere, to function through fear while the fear was happening, to survive by subdividing the experience, by finding, even in the worst moments, a part of the mind that was watching rather than simply experiencing, a part that was counting, cataloguing, noting what was happening, with a stillness that the chaos around it could not fully reach. This is not a gift, this is an adaptation, a survival mechanism produced by an environment that required it. And Andrew Huberman, with the precision of the neuroscientist, can tell you exactly what that adaptation looks like in the brain. The developing nervous system, particularly in the first decade of life, during the periods of maximum neuroplasticity, is shaped by the experiences it encounters, not passively, actively. The brain is a prediction machine. Its primary function is not to perceive the world accurately, but to predict what the world will do next, based on what it has done before. And those predictions are built from experience, from the patterns that repetition embeds in the neural architecture. A child raised in an environment of chronic threat develops a nervous system calibrated for chronic threat. The threat detection systems, the amygdala, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the sympathetic nervous system, are sensitized, tuned to fine frequencies of danger, able to detect subtle signals of approaching threat that a nervous system calibrated for safety would miss entirely. This is not damage, or rather, it is damage in the context of safety and a resource in the context of threat. The same sensitization that produces hypervigilance in a peaceful environment produces extraordinary situational awareness in a dangerous one. Goggins' childhood did not break him ultimately, but it very nearly did. For years, through adolescence and into early adulthood, the adaptation that had kept him alive in his father's house was producing destruction in a different context. The hypervigilance, the hair-trigger stress response, the learned smallness that had been survival strategy in Toccoa and became self-limitation everywhere else. He was, at 24, 300 pounds, working as a pest exterminator, living in a state that he has described as existing rather than living, going through the motions of a life while the depth of what he was capable of, the extraordinary capacity for suffering and endurance that his childhood had produced as a byproduct, remained entirely undeployed. And then something happened that Huberman would describe in neurological terms and Goggins describes in terms of a moment of confrontation so raw it barely has language. He saw a television program about Navy SEAL training, about Bud/S, about Hell Week, the 130-hour period of continuous physical and psychological stress that is the central rite of passage in the production of a Navy SEAL. He watched men doing something that looked, from the outside, like systematic destruction, being cold and wet and sleep-deprived and physically demolished for days at a time, and something in him recognized it, not as familiar in the ordinary sense, familiar in the sense that the nervous system recognizes the landscape it was built for. His childhood had been Hell Week, involuntary, uncontrolled, without meaning or agency or an off-ramp, but the raw physiological experience of sustained threat, sustained discomfort, sustained demand on every resource the organism possessed, that was not new to him. What he understood, and this is the crucial turn, the one that Huberman's science makes legible, is that the same nervous system that had been built by his childhood's involuntary suffering could be deployed in a chosen suffering, that the adaptation could be redirected, that the resource that had been produced by the damage could be placed in service of something that the damage itself could never have produced. But here's the strange part. The redirecting was not easy, not in the way that having an insight is sometimes imagined to be easy. The gap between recognizing the possibility and actually making the neurological change, actually rewiring the associations, actually building the new architecture on top of the old, was not a gap closed by motivation alone. Huberman is explicit about this in the neuroscience of habit and identity change. Motivation, the felt sense of wanting to be different, of being inspired by a vision of a different self, is a starting condition. It is not a sufficient condition. The nervous system changes through repetition, through the specific, concrete, incremental, unglamorous process of doing the hard thing when the hard thing doesn't feel possible, and doing it again and doing it again, until the doing of it has produced the neural infrastructure that makes the doing of it feel different. The first time you do something that challenges your nervous system, it is new threat. The stress response activates fully. Everything in the system says, this is dangerous. Turn back, negotiate, find the exit. The 10th time, the response is attenuated. The system has the experience of having done this before and survived. The prediction machine updates. The threat assessment changes. The 100th time, what was once at the edge of the possible has become the floor. This is not inspiration. It is not character. It is neurobiology. The calloused mind is a neurological structure, built by repetition, by the specific, uncomfortable, non-negotiable process of going into the difficulty and coming back over and over until the nervous system has enough evidence of surviving that the survival is the default prediction rather than the threatened exception. Goggins built this through methods that no clinician would recommend, that no ethical research protocol could replicate, through a process that was, at points, genuinely dangerous to his physical and psychological health. But the structure he built is real. The neuroscience says so. And the question, the one that Huberman's laboratory and Goggins' life are both, in their different ways, pressing, is whether the same structure can be built through methods that are less extreme, through deliberate, purposive, controlled exposure to discomfort that captures the neurological mechanism without the unnecessary risk of the uncontrolled version. The answer, the research suggests, is yes, but the mechanism, the actual biological engine of the change, is the same. Difficulty survived again. Nobody talks about dopamine correctly, not in the popular culture, not in the wellness industry, not in the motivational frameworks that have accumulated around the idea of building better habits and optimizing human performance. The popular account of dopamine is that it is the pleasure chemical, the reward. The thing your brain releases when something good happens, reinforcing the behavior that produced the good thing and making you want to do it again. This is not wrong. It is incomplete in a way that changes everything. Andrew Huberman is particularly precise about this because the complete account of dopamine, what it actually is and what it actually does in the human nervous system, has implications that run directly counter to the dominant cultural strategies for motivation, productivity, and the pursuit of goals. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the anticipation and pursuit chemical. The distinction matters enormously. Dopamine is released not primarily when you receive the reward. It is released in the anticipation of the reward, in the reaching toward it, in the effortful pursuit. The subjective experience of dopamine is not the pleasure of having. It is the specific, energized, forward-oriented feeling of pursuing something you believe you can get. This is why the anticipation of a vacation is often more pleasurable than the vacation itself. Why the period of pursuing a goal is often more vividly alive than the achievement of it. Why the reward, when it finally arrives, so often produces a flatness, a brief satisfaction followed immediately by a kind of emptiness that is disproportionate to the effort invested in reaching it. The system was never designed to arrive, it was designed to pursue. Now think about this for a moment. Modern life has done something to this system that the system was not designed to accommodate. It has made the dopamine available without the effort, without the pursuit, without the gap between the wanting and the getting that the dopamine system was built to bridge. Social media delivers social validation in doses. Pornography delivers sexual arousal without physical presence. Processed food delivers caloric reward without caloric effort. Streaming services deliver narrative satisfaction without waiting. Entertainment platforms have become extraordinarily good at delivering the next hit of dopamine before the current one has fully resolved. The result, and Huberman is explicit about this in both the research he cites and the framework he has developed, is not simply that people enjoy these things too much. The result is the dysregulation of the dopamine system itself. The baseline, the level of motivation and energy, and forward-oriented engagement that the person feels in the absence of external stimulation, drops. The gap between the stimulated state and the unstimulated state widens. Ordinary life, life without the constant dopamine delivery of the digital environment, feels flat, effortful, not worth the energy. And the things that genuinely matter, the goals that require sustained effort over months or years, the relationships that require showing up consistently when showing up is not immediately rewarding, the development of skills that require the extended tolerance of incompetence before competence, these feel, in the dysregulated dopamine environment, almost impossible to sustain. Not because the person is lazy, because the neurological substrate of motivation has been tuned by repeated exposure to cheap dopamine to expect a return on effort that the genuinely valuable things cannot deliver on the schedule the dysregulated system requires. Goggins arrived at a version of this understanding through an entirely different route. He noticed, not in the language of neuroscience, in the language of someone who has spent extraordinary amounts of time in the territory of his own motivation, that the people who stop in difficult situations are almost never stopping because they have reached their actual physical limit. They are stopping because the calculation has tipped, because the pain of continuing has exceeded the pain of stopping, because the discomfort of the current moment has become more vivid than the pull of the goal. And he noticed something else, that the people who do not stop, including eventually himself, are not people who do not feel the calculation. They feel it. They feel the same impulse toward the exit that everyone feels. The difference is not the absence of the impulse, it is a different relationship to it. He developed what he calls the accountability mirror, the practice, brutal in its simplicity and in its requirement, of looking at yourself without protection, without the comfortable narrative, without the explanations and the justifications and the self-talk that makes the gap between who you are and who you could be feel acceptable, just looking at the actual truth, at the specific ways in which you are not yet what you are capable of being. This is not motivational in the conventional sense. It is not the uplifting, forward-looking, strength-focused approach that most performance frameworks recommend. It is darker than that, more confrontational, more willing to let the actual weight of the gap, the specific distance between the current reality and the potential reality, land without softening. But here's the strange part. What Huberman's science suggests about why this works is genuinely counterintuitive given the dominant wellness culture. The research on motivation and goal pursuit indicates that the most robust and most durable motivation is not produced by focusing exclusively on the positive vision of the goal, not by visualization of success, in the simple sense of imagining the achievement. The most robust motivation is produced by what the researcher Gabriele Oettingen calls mental contrasting, the alternation between the vivid imagining of the desired outcome and the honest confrontation with the obstacles, the current reality, the gap. The gap is not the enemy of motivation. The gap is the engine of motivation. The dopamine system responds to the gap between where you are and where you want to be. The wider and more clearly perceived the gap, the more motivational energy the system generates in the direction of closing it. The problem is not seeing the gap. The problem is seeing the gap and having a nervous system that is calibrated through the chronic delivery of cheap dopamine to prefer the exit over the effort. Goggins' accountability mirror is, in essence, a technology for making the gap undeniable, for removing the comfortable narratives that make the gap feel smaller than it is, for producing the specific, slightly uncomfortable quality of self-perception that the dopamine system, when it has not been entirely dysregulated, responds to as a call to action. But the mirror only works if the person can tolerate what they see, can stay in the discomfort of accurate self-perception long enough for it to produce direction rather than despair. And tolerating that discomfort, developing the specific capacity to look clearly at the gap and not flee from it, to let the accurate self-assessment generate energy rather than paralysis, is itself a skill built by practice, by the same repetition and incremental exposure that builds any neurological capacity. You do not begin with the ability to look clearly, you build it, one uncomfortable, honest moment at a time. Consider the specific experience of entering cold water, not gradually, not the slow negotiated descent of someone easing themselves in to avoid the shock, the plunge, the full-body sudden immersion in water cold enough to produce an immediate, involuntary, total system response. Your breath catches, or rather, the breathing pattern shatters. The body produces a sharp, uncontrolled gasping inhalation followed by hyperventilation, the breathing becoming rapid, shallow, automatic, entirely outside the usual domain of the conscious control. The heart rate spikes. Adrenaline floods the system. Every peripheral blood vessel constricts as the body redirects blood to the core. The skin screams, And somewhere in the mind, in the specific ancient mammalian circuit that evaluates situations on the axis of threat, a very loud, very clear signal registers. Get out, now. The signal is not subtle, it is not a gentle suggestion. It is the full force of one of the most conserved and most powerful regulatory systems in the human organism, saying with everything it has, this is threatening, this requires exit, do it immediately, now stay in the water, not forever. 90 seconds, 2 minutes, long enough for the breath to begin to slow, for the hyperventilation to give way to something more controlled, for the heart rate to begin its descent from the spike, for the cold which felt like burning to become something that is still intense but no longer unbearable, for the adrenaline response to begin its resolution, and then notice what happens in the next several hours. Huberman has documented this extensively because the evidence is unusually clean. Cold water immersion is one of the most reliable methods for studying the stress response and its aftermath in a controlled way. The spike in adrenaline and noradrenaline that cold water immersion produces is among the largest that can be reliably induced without genuine danger. And what follows the spike, provided the person stayed in the discomfort long enough for the initial response to begin to resolve, is a sustained, hours-long elevation in baseline mood, focus and energy that is traceable to the specific neurochemical aftermath of having gone through the stress response rather than avoiding it. The stress response, fully activated, fully experienced, and then resolved through the person's own nervous system regulation rather than through exit, produces in its resolution the specific neurological signature of genuine well-being, not the flat relief of escape, not the short-lived pleasure of removing an aversive stimulus. The longer, deeper, more stable quality of a nervous system that has been tested and has regulated itself. That has demonstrated to itself, through the concrete evidence of the experience, that it can handle what it handled. This is the ancient bargain. The stress response was not designed to be avoided. It was designed to be engaged, resolved and metabolized. The resolution and metabolization are the mechanism through which the nervous system updates its calibration, through which the prediction machine adjusts its predictions about what is survivable, through which the organism expands incrementally the range of what it can handle. But here's the strange part. The benefit is not available if the person escapes before the initial spike resolves. This is one of the most important and most counterintuitive findings in the stress biology literature. The outcome, the neurological benefit, the calibration update, the expansion of capacity, depends on staying in the difficulty long enough for the stress response to begin its own resolution, on not exiting at the moment of maximum discomfort, which is precisely the moment at which exit feels most compelling. The benefit is downstream of the discomfort, not adjacent to it, not simultaneous with it. Downstream, on the other side of the staying. Goggins talks about something that maps onto this with the precision of someone who found the principle through experience rather than research. He talks about the moment in any sustained physical or psychological difficulty when the mind presents what he calls the first quit, the point at which the calculation tips, at which the discomfort of continuing becomes more vivid than the pull of the goal, and the mind begins to generate reasons to stop. The first quit is not the limit. The first quit is the beginning of the actual work. Because everything before the first quit, the preparation, the motivation, the training, the planning, has been operating in the domain of what the person already believed was possible, what the existing nervous system was already calibrated for, what the existing prediction machine already had as survivable. The first quit is the boundary of the known territory. What is on the other side of it, the specific experience of going past the point where the mind said stop, is the territory where the calibration actually changes. Consider the specific experience of entering cold water, not gradually, not the slow negotiated descent of someone easing themselves in to avoid the shock, the plunge, the full body sudden immersion in water cold enough to produce an immediate, involuntary, total system response. Your breath catches, or rather, the breathing pattern shatters. The body produces a sharp, uncontrolled, gasping inhalation followed by hyperventilation, the breathing becoming rapid, shallow, automatic, entirely outside the usual domain of the conscious control. The heart rate spikes. Adrenaline floods the system. Every peripheral blood vessel constricts as the body redirects blood to the core. The skin screams, and somewhere in the mind, in the specific ancient mammalian circuit that evaluates situations on the axis of threat, a very loud, very clear signal registers. Get out, now. The signal is not subtle. It is not a gentle suggestion. It is the full force of one of the most conserved and most powerful regulatory systems in the human organism saying with everything it has, this is threatening. This requires exit. Do it immediately. Now stay in the water. Not forever. 90 seconds, 2 minutes. Long enough for the breath to begin to slow, for the hyperventilation to give way to something more controlled, for the heart rate to begin its descent from the spike, for the cold which felt like burning to become something that is still intense but no longer unbearable, for the adrenaline response to begin its resolution, and then notice what happens in the next several hours. Huberman has documented this extensively because the evidence is unusually clean. Cold water immersion is one of the most reliable methods for studying the stress response and its aftermath in a controlled way. The spike in adrenaline and noradrenaline that cold water immersion produces is among the largest that can be reliably induced without genuine danger. And what follows the spike, provided the person stayed in the discomfort long enough for the initial response to begin to resolve, is a sustained, hours-long elevation in baseline mood, focus and energy that is traceable to the specific neurochemical aftermath of having gone through the stress response rather than avoiding it. The stress response, fully activated, fully experienced, and then resolved through the person's own nervous system regulation rather than through exit, produces in its resolution the specific neurological signature of genuine well-being, not the flat relief of escape, not the short-lived pleasure of removing an aversive stimulus. The longer, deeper, more stable quality of a nervous system that has been tested and has regulated itself. That has demonstrated to itself, through the concrete evidence of the experience, that it can handle what it handled. This is the ancient bargain. The stress response was not designed to be avoided. It was designed to be engaged, resolved and metabolized. The resolution and metabolization are the mechanism through which the nervous system updates its calibration, through which the prediction machine adjusts its predictions about what is survivable, through which the organism expands incrementally the range of what it can handle. But here's the strange part. The benefit is not available if the person escapes before the initial spike resolves. This is one of the most important and most counterintuitive findings in the stress biology literature. The outcome, the neurological benefit, the calibration update, the expansion of capacity, depends on staying in the difficulty long enough for the stress response to begin its own resolution. On not exiting at the moment of maximum discomfort, which is precisely the moment at which exit feels most compelling. The benefit is downstream of the discomfort, not adjacent to it, not simultaneous with it. Downstream, on the other side of the staying. Goggins talks about something that maps onto this with the precision of someone who found the principle through experience rather than research. He talks about the moment in any sustained physical or psychological difficulty when the mind presents what he calls the first quit, the point at which the calculation tips, at which the discomfort of continuing becomes more vivid than the pull of the goal, and the mind begins to generate reasons to stop. The first quit is not the limit. The first quit is the beginning of the actual work. Because everything before the first quit, the preparation, the motivation, the training, the planning, has been operating in the domain of what the person already believed was possible, what the existing nervous system was already calibrated for, what the existing prediction machine already had as survivable. The first quit is the boundary of the known territory. What is on the other side of it, the specific experience of going past the point where the mind said stop, is the territory where the calibration actually changes. There is a version of yourself that does not yet exist, not a fantasy version, not the aspirational self of the vision board or the 5-year plan or the motivational speech. Something more specific than any of those. The version of yourself that exists on the other side of the difficulties you have not yet gone through. The self that would be produced, neurologically, psychologically, characterologically, by the specific experiences of going past the limits you currently believe you have. This is not a metaphor. Huberman is clear about this in the neuroscience of identity and self-concept. The self-image, the specific, held, deeply embedded sense of who you are and what you're capable of, is not a fixed property discovered through introspection. It is a model, a predictive framework, built from the accumulated evidence of what you have done and survived and come through. Updated, like all predictive frameworks, by new data. The person who has never gone past the first quit has a self-model that does not contain the experience of going past the first quit. And the absence of that experience in the model is not neutral. It is a positive prediction, a prediction that the first quit is where the limit is, because the limit has never been tested beyond that point. The person who's gone past the first quit repeatedly, under conditions of genuine difficulty, has a self-model that contains the evidence of doing so. A model that, when the next first quit arrives, has access to a library of previous occasions on which the first quit was not the actual limit. And that library changes the prediction, changes the assessment, changes, at the deepest level of the architecture, what the system believes is possible. This is what Goggins means when he talks about the cookie jar. The metaphor is simple and the principle is profound. The cookie jar is the mental repository of every hard thing you have done, every time you went past the point where you wanted to stop and didn't stop, every time the calculation tipped toward exit and you didn't exit, every time the pain was real and the discomfort was genuine and the first quit was loudly insisting on its authority and you went past it anyway. These experiences are not just memories, they are neural architecture. They are the building material of a self-model that knows, at the level of direct experiential evidence rather than wishful thinking, that it can handle what it looks like it might not be able to handle. The cookie jar is the identity, and the identity is built by the cookies, one at a time. Through the specific, unglamorous, repetitive, uncomfortable process of going into difficulty and coming back, going into difficulty and coming back until the going and coming back has become the structural expectation rather than the impossible exception. But here's the strange part. The identity that suffering builds is not the identity of someone who enjoys suffering, not the identity of the person who's become numb to discomfort or who has romanticized difficulty into a philosophy of masochism. The identity is something more specific and more functional than either of these. It is the identity of the person who has evidence. Evidence that is not borrowed from anyone else's experience. Not the motivational speech of someone who has done extraordinary things. Not the theoretical framework of someone who has studied extraordinary things. The first person directly experienced neurologically embedded evidence of their own specific history of going through difficult things. And this evidence operates differently than borrowed evidence, because it does not require belief. It does not require motivation. It does not require the maintenance of an inspired state that is inevitably temporary. It operates as a baseline prediction, a default assumption, the thing the nervous system reaches for automatically when the next difficult thing arrives. Goggins talks about this in terms of what he calls the uncommon amongst the uncommon, not the idea that he is genetically exceptional. The observation that the people who perform at the highest levels of endurance, in the military and ultra-athletics, in any domain that requires sustained engagement with genuine difficulty, are not primarily distinguished by their physical capacity. They are distinguished by the specific quality of their relationship to the suffering that their performance requires. They expect it, not in the resigned sense, in the prepared sense, in the sense of a nervous system that has been in this territory before and has enough experience of it to be oriented within it rather than overwhelmed by it. The suffering is not a surprise to them, and the not surprise changes everything about how the system responds to it. Now think about what this means for ordinary life. Not the extraordinary performance domains, the ordinary life, the project that is taking longer than expected, the relationship that requires showing up when showing up is hard, the professional challenge that requires extending past the edge of current competence, the physical health practice that requires consistency on the days when consistency has no immediate reward. These are all versions of the same situation. They all have a first quit, a point at which the calculation tips and the compelling case for stopping presents itself with all the force that the nervous system can muster. And the identity that has been built by going past the first quit in other contexts carries into this context. Not perfectly, not automatically, not without effort, but the self-model that contains the evidence of previous going past is structurally different from the self-model that does not contain that evidence. The cookies matter. Every one of them matters. Not because suffering is the point, because what the suffering produces when it is engaged purposively, when it is gone through rather than around, when it is metabolized by the nervous system into the architectural update of expanded capacity, is the only kind of self-knowledge that is not borrowed. The knowledge that you can handle what you can handle, built by handling it, stored in the cookie jar, available at the moment of the next first quit. Whether you use it is the only question. There is a truth about the body that most approaches to human performance would prefer to discuss only in certain moods. The body is not a vehicle for the mind. The body is not the instrument through which the will executes its decisions. The body is not, in any honest accounting, subordinate to the intention. The body keeps score. Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma established this with clinical clarity. But the principle goes beyond trauma in the clinical sense. It applies to the full range of human experience, to every accumulated exposure, every unresolved stress response, every moment of genuine difficulty that was either metabolized or bypassed. The body holds the record. In the muscle tension that does not release, in the chronic cortisol elevation that shows up in blood work and inflammatory markers and sleep architecture, in the specific patterned, predictable ways that the physical organism responds to stress cues long after the original stressor is gone. Huberman is precise about the neuroscience here. The body's stress response systems, or the HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, the inflammatory cascades, do not simply activate in response to present moment threats. They activate in response to predicted threats, in response to sensory cues, environmental patterns, social signals that the brain has learned to associate with previous stress. The nervous system is running predictions about the future based on patterns from the past, and those predictions produce physiological responses in the body right now before the predicted event has occurred, sometimes in the absence of any actual current threat. This is why trauma survivors experience physiological stress responses in situations that are objectively safe. Why combat veterans respond to car backfires. Why people who grew up in genuinely threatening environments feel physiologically activated in situations that the rational mind recognizes as non-threatening. The body is not confused. The body is running its best prediction based on its most relevant data, and the most relevant data is the pattern that the previous experience embedded. But here is where it gets interesting, and where the conversation between Huberman's science and Goggins' experience becomes most precise. The same mechanism that produces the stress response to predicted threats also produces the stress response to predicted challenges. The prediction machine does not only predict danger, it predicts difficulty. And the predictions it makes about difficulty, about whether the upcoming challenge is survivable, about whether the organism has the resources to meet what is coming, these predictions are made from the same architectural substrate, from the same accumulated evidence of past performance. The body that has been through genuine difficulty and has come through, that has the physical and neurological record of having metabolized stress rather than simply avoided it, runs different predictions about upcoming difficulty than the body that has been carefully protected from it. This is not metaphysical, it is measurable. In heart rate variability, the specific metric that reflects the nervous system's flexibility in moving between sympathetic and parasympathetic states, which is one of the most reliable physiological indicators of resilience. In baseline cortisol levels, in the inflammatory markers that reflect the degree to which the body is in a chronic state of stress preparation, in the sleep architecture that either facilitates recovery or prevents it, the body that has been trained in difficulty, that has been exposed to controlled, purposive, progressively increasing challenge and has recovered from that challenge, is physically different from the body that has not been. Not just stronger, different in its architecture, different in the predictions it makes, different in the physiological state it inhabits at baseline. But here's the strange part. Goggins discovered something about this that the research supports, but that most performance frameworks do not adequately emphasize. The body's scorekeeping works in both directions. The body that has been through genuine difficulty and has not been given adequate recovery has been pushed past the stress threshold without the metabolization of the stress response, without the resolution and the rest that converts the stress exposure into architectural adaptation. That body does not build capacity. It accumulates damage. The distinction between training and trauma at the physiological level is not primarily the intensity of the stressor. It is the presence or absence of recovery. The presence or absence of the parasympathetic restoration that converts the sympathetic activation of the stress response into the building material of expanded capacity. Goggins has been honest about this in his own story in a way that the mythology around him sometimes obscures. The methods that produced his extraordinary capacity also produced genuine physical damage. Broken bones run through rather than rested. Injuries managed rather than treated. A relationship to recovery that was, at points, as dismissive as the relationship to difficulty was relentless, and the body kept that score too. The point is not that Goggins' approach was wrong, it is that the mechanism requires both sides of the equation, the stress exposure and the recovery, the sympathetic activation and the parasympathetic restoration, the going through and the coming back to rest. Huberman is among the most articulate voices in current science on the specific protocols for maximizing the recovery side of this equation. Sleep, specifically the non-negotiable primacy of sleep quality and duration as the single most important recovery intervention available. The specific role of non-sleep deep rest, the deliberate parasympathetic activation through practices like yoga nidra or NSDR protocols in accelerating the conversion of stress exposure into structural adaptation. The timing of exercise in relation to circadian rhythms, the role of cold and heat exposure in driving parasympathetic recovery after sympathetic activation. These are not optional optimizations for the person who's already functioning well, they are the other half of the mechanism. The side of the bargain that the culture of relentless performance, the culture that Goggins, at his most extreme, represents and that the mythology around him sometimes celebrates uncritically, tends to undervalue. You cannot build what you do not recover from. The stress and the rest are not opposites. They are partners. The stress is the signal for adaptation. The rest is when the adaptation happens. Remove either one and the system does not produce the capacity. It produces either stagnation or damage. The body keeps score on both. The challenge received and metabolized becomes the expanded capacity. The challenge received without metabolization becomes the accumulated debt. And the debt, the specific physiological architectural debt of the body that has been pushed without recovery, is not abstract. It is real and it is measurable and it does not remain invisible forever. The body will present the account, on its own schedule, whether you are ready or not. Something happens in the mind of a person in genuine difficulty that does not happen anywhere else. Not in comfort, not in pleasure, not in the ordinary unstressed functioning of a person moving through a life that makes reasonable demands and provides reasonable resources for meeting them. Something that is only available in the specific territory of being genuinely pushed, of being in a situation that requires more than the current version of the self confidently possesses. The observer emerges, not a mystical entity, a specific neurological and psychological function, the capacity for metacognition, for self-monitoring, for the observation of one's own mental and physical states from a slight but crucial distance. The part of the mind that can, even in the middle of suffering, notice the suffering. That can say this is happening, this is what it feels like, this is the information. Huberman talks about this in the context of the prefrontal cortex and its relationship to the stress response. One of the most reliably documented effects of acute stress is the downregulation of the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, rational decision-making, impulse control, and the complex executive functions that distinguish human cognition. When the stress response activates fully, the brain redistributes resources away from the slow, metabolically expensive prefrontal functions toward the fast, reactive, survival-oriented functions of the subcortical systems. This is appropriate. In a genuine emergency, you do not need to be deliberating carefully about long-term consequences. You need to be acting. The system is designed to facilitate that. But the design creates a problem in the context of chosen difficulty, in the context of training, performance, endurance. Because the prefrontal cortex is also where the relationship to suffering is mediated, where the interpretation of the stress response as threat or as challenge, as signal of danger or as signal of preparation is formed, where the meaning of the difficulty is held. Downregulate the prefrontal cortex and you lose access to the meaning. And without the meaning, the difficulty is simply pain, simply aversive, simply the unrelieved signal of something wrong. The training of the observer, the deliberate cultivation of the metacognitive capacity to maintain some degree of prefrontal engagement even in the middle of significant stress, is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of genuine resilience development. Goggins calls it the governor. The idea, drawn from mechanical engineering, where a governor is a device that limits the speed of an engine to prevent damage, is that the mind has a built-in limiting mechanism, a mechanism that, in the presence of sufficient difficulty, steps in with convincing arguments for stopping, with genuinely compelling subjective evidence that the limit has been reached, with the full authority of the stress response behind it, and the capacity to observe the governor, to notice its activation, to hear its arguments, to feel the full force of its signal, without immediately complying with it, is what Goggins identifies as the specific skill that distinguishes the person who goes past the first quit from the person who does not. Not the absence of the governor, not the inability to feel the limit, the capacity to feel it and maintain enough observer distance from it to make a choice about whether to comply or. But here's the strange part. This observer capacity is not simply a matter of toughness in the popular sense. It is not produced by insisting through sheer willpower that the pain does not matter. That approach, the white-knuckling, the brute suppression of the pain signal through the application of pure willpower, is not what the observer does, and it is not, Huberman's research suggests, what produces the neurological benefits of voluntary stress engagement. What produces the benefits is something more subtle. The capacity to be fully present to the difficulty, to feel the pain signal completely, to let the stress response activate fully, to not be dissociated from the experience, while simultaneously maintaining enough metacognitive engagement to hold the experience in a context of meaning, to know why it is happening, to hold the relationship between the current discomfort and the goal that the discomfort is in service of. The observer does not deny the pain. The observer holds the pain in context, and holding pain in context, particularly during the most intense phases of the stress response, when the prefrontal cortex is under maximum pressure to downregulate, is a skill. One of the most valuable skills available to a human being, one that must be built deliberately, through practice, through the specific repetition of going into difficulty while maintaining the observer. Meditation research is relevant here, and Huberman has been explicit about it. The specific practices that develop metacognitive capacity, practices that train the observer, that build the ability to notice the contents of consciousness without being immediately absorbed into them, produce measurable changes in the prefrontal cortex, in its thickness, in its connectivity to the amygdala and the stress response systems, in its ability to maintain function under conditions of elevated stress. The meditator who has developed a genuine observer capacity is not simply calmer than the non-meditator. They are neurologically better equipped for exactly the function that Goggins is describing. The function of being in the difficulty and holding the context simultaneously, of feeling the first quit and having enough observer distance from it to make a deliberate choice rather than an automatic one. These two things, the meditator's observer and the operator's going past the governor, are not opposites. They are the same capacity approached from different directions. The meditator builds the observer in stillness. In the controlled environment of the cushion, training the prefrontal engagement with the contents of consciousness in a context of reduced external demand. The operator builds the observer in motion, in the field under load, in the conditions that most closely approximate the situations in which the capacity will actually be needed. Both are building the same thing, the mind that watches the mind in pain without being destroyed by what it watches. The observer that holds the context when the stress response has done everything in its power to eliminate the context. The prefrontal function that stays online, however partially, however imperfectly, when everything in the system is arguing that the situation requires something faster and simpler and more reactive than deliberate engagement. This is not a small thing. This is the thing, the capacity that determines whether the suffering builds or destroys, whether the difficulty expands or diminishes, whether the first quit is the last word or the beginning of the conversation. There is a limit to what the laboratory can tell you. Not because the science is inadequate, not because the research is poorly designed or the measurements are imprecise. The science is genuinely extraordinary. Huberman's work and the broader neuroscience of stress, performance, and resilience that he synthesizes and communicates represents one of the most sophisticated accounts of human capacity ever produced. It has genuine implications for how people live. Real tools, real protocols, real mechanisms described with the precision that a century of scientific method has made possible. But the laboratory works with what can be measured, and there are things that happen in the territory of extreme human endurance that the measurements do not capture, not because they are supernatural, because they are first person, because the specific quality of what it is to be inside the experience, to be at mile 80 of a 100-mile race on broken feet, in the specific darkness of that particular territory, is not available to any instrument outside the person who's in it. This is not mysticism. It is the hard, practical, irreducible fact that phenomenological experience is not fully translatable into third-person description. The map and the territory are not the same thing, and the territory of extreme human suffering that entered voluntarily, purposively, with the specific intention of finding out what is on the other side of every limit the mind has erected, that territory yields knowledge that the laboratory is not equipped to produce. Goggins knows things that Huberman cannot measure. He knows what it feels like when the governor fails, not metaphorically, actually fails. when the limiting mechanism has been overridden so many times that it has, temporarily in that specific moment under those specific conditions, stopped insisting. When the space between the self and the suffering has closed enough that the suffering is simply what is happening, and the question of whether to comply with the signal to stop is no longer being deliberated, but has been settled so far in advance by the accumulated weight of previous choices that it is no longer a live question. He knows what is on the other side of that. And what is on the other side is not the absence of pain. He is explicit and insistent about this. The pain does not stop. The physical experience does not become comfortable. What changes is the relationship to it, the specific quality of a consciousness that has been in genuine difficulty long enough and frequently enough that the difficulty has become not normal exactly, but inhabitable. Familiar territory. And in familiar territory, even terrible familiar territory, there is a quality of orientation that is not available in unfamiliar territory. The panic of the unknown is gone. What remains is the pain and the knowledge of the pain and the specific earned confidence that the pain has not yet been the last thing. Huberman's research on stress inoculation approaches this from the outside, documenting the neurological changes, the updated predictions, the recalibrated threat assessments, the architectural evidence of expanded capacity and the measurable dimensions. But the inside of the experience, the specific phenomenology of what happens to consciousness when the body is at genuine limit and the mind has learned, through the accumulation of previous going through, to inhabit that place, that is what Goggins brings that the science cannot substitute for. And here is where the two traditions, the scientific and the experiential, converge on something that neither can produce alone. The science tells you the mechanism is real, that the adaptation is measurable, that the neuroplasticity is genuine, that the capacity is genuinely expandable through the specific purposive repeated engagement with voluntary difficulty. The experience tells you what the expanded capacity feels like from the inside, what it is to inhabit a self that has been built by going through hard things, not just the functional benefits, the better performance, the greater endurance, the expanded threshold, the specific quality of the person, the relationship to fear, the relationship to the future, the way that a consciousness that has been in the territory of genuine difficulty and come back carries itself through a world that has not changed, that is still full of the same difficulties and the same uncertainties and the same invitations to the first quit, but that now presents differently to the person who's been past the first quit enough times to know what it looks like from the other side. But here's the strange part. Goggins insists with a directness that is one of his most distinctive qualities, that the knowledge is not transferable by description. You cannot be told what is on the other side of the first quit. You cannot receive the knowledge through a book or a podcast or a conversation. The information that changes the self-model, that updates the prediction machine at the level that actually matters, at the level that changes what the system believes is possible rather than simply what it can be persuaded to attempt, that information is only available through direct experience. Not because the territory is ineffable, because the nervous system learns through doing, not through hearing about doing. The self-model is updated by evidence, and the only evidence that updates the self-model at the deepest level is first-person evidence, the actual going through, the actual coming back, the actual cookie in the jar. This is not a reason not to read the science. The science is genuinely valuable. It provides the framework, the mechanism, the understanding of why the experience produces what it produces. It makes the territory legible in ways that reduce the risk of the going in being genuinely dangerous rather than productively difficult. But the framework is not the experience, and the experience is the point. Huberman gives you the map. Goggins, through his life, through his story, through the specific and unrepeatable account of what happened to him and what he did with what happened, gives you the testimony of someone who has been in the territory. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. The map without the territory is theory. The territory without the map is risk without context. Together, the scientific understanding of the mechanism and the first-person testimony of what it is to be inside it, they point at something that is neither purely scientific nor purely autobiographical. They point at what you are actually capable of, not in the abstract, not as a category of human beings, specifically, in the particular life you are living, in the specific difficulty that is in front of you right now or will be in front of you when the next first quit arrives. The broken feet know something that the laboratory cannot measure. They know that the limit was not where it appeared to be, and they know that the knowing of this, the the direct, first-person, architecturally embedded knowledge of where the actual limit is, changes everything about what happens next time. Everything we have followed through the neuroscience and the biography, through the dopamine dynamics and the cookie jar, through the stress inoculation protocols and the broken feet and the observer and the governor, has been building toward a question that neither Huberman's laboratory nor Goggins's life fully answers. Not because they have not gone far enough, because the question is not the kind that science or autobiography, however rigorous and however honest, can finally close. The question is this: what is the suffering for? Not in the mechanical sense. The mechanism is clear. The stress response, engaged and metabolized, produces adaptation. The difficulty, gone through rather than around, produces expanded capacity. The first quit, past, produces the updated self-model. The neuroplasticity is real. The architecture changes. The capacity expands. All of that is established. But the question underneath the mechanism is different. The question underneath the mechanism is the one that arrives at 3 a.m, when the difficulty is not the chosen difficulty of cold water immersion or voluntary hard training. When the difficulty is the kind that was not invited, was not part of any protocol, did not come with any scientific framework for understanding its adaptive value. The loss you did not choose, the diagnosis that arrived without asking, the failure that collapsed something you had spent years building, the grief that does not resolve on any schedule that the research on resilience has documented. What is that suffering for? And here is where the conversation between Huberman and Goggins, as valuable and as honest as it is, runs into its limit. Not because they are wrong about what they know, because what they do is not the whole of what there is to know. Huberman's science is rigorous within its domain. The domain is the mechanism, how the nervous system processes stress, what protocols produce what outcomes, what the research says about the relationship between voluntary difficulty and expanded capacity. This is genuine knowledge, important knowledge, knowledge that has already changed how many people relate to their own physiological states and their own capacity for growth. But the mechanism is not the meaning. Knowing that acute stress followed by recovery produces neuroplasticity does not tell you why the suffering matters, does not tell you what it is doing in a life, does not tell you whether the loss you are carrying, the one that does not fit any protocol, that cannot be converted into a cookie in any cookie jar, that remains months or years later, simply the weight of what happened, whether that loss is building anything at all. Goggins is more honest about this limit than the mythology around him sometimes allows. His story is not only the story of suffering as tool, it is also the story of suffering as wound, of a childhood that did not simply produce the raw material for extraordinary endurance. That produced damage, real, lasting, specific damage, relationships that suffered because of what the damage produced, a version of himself that was for years at war with the people closest to him, a kind of relentlessness that served him in the field and cost him everywhere else. He has been honest about this increasingly in later work. The calloused mind is not a complete solution to the problem of suffering. It is a way of relating to chosen difficulty that produces extraordinary performance outcomes. It is not a philosophy of life that resolves the full complexity of what suffering is and does to a human being. But here's the strange part. The limit of both Huberman's science and Goggins's method, the place where the mechanism meets something the mechanism cannot fully account for, is not a failure of either. It is the edge of the domain, the honest acknowledgement that the scientific account of suffering and the performative account of suffering are both partial accounts of something larger, something that the philosophers we have met in other scripts have been circling from different directions. Nietzsche with his Amor Fati, Dostoevsky with his psychology of suffering and redemption, Schopenhauer with the mechanism of the will, Jung with the confrontation with the shadow and the depth beneath the depth. What all of them, from their different directions, are pointing at is the same thing that Huberman's science and Goggins's life point at without quite naming. The suffering that is metabolized, that is gone through rather than around, that is engaged rather than avoided, that is held in some relationship to meaning rather than simply endured in the absence of meaning. This suffering does something to the person that the comfortable life does not do. Not something the comfortable life fails to do because it is inadequate. Something the comfortable life structurally cannot do. Because the thing that the suffering does, when it is engaged honestly, when it is not fled and not romanticized but simply met, is the thing that requires the limit to be reached. The thing that only happens in the territory past the first quit. The thing that only the actual experience of being at the edge of what you thought you were and finding out there is more, the thing that only that experience can produce. It produces the self that knows from the inside what it is made of, not believes, not hopes, not has been told, knows, through the evidence of having been in the difficulty and coming back, through the specific, irreplaceable, non-borrowable knowledge that comes from the cookie jar that you built yourself, from the self-model that was updated not by inspiration, but by the accumulated, repetitive, unglamorous evidence of going through. This is what Huberman's neuroscience describes in the language of neuroplasticity and stress adaptation. This is what Goggins embodies in the language of the 40% rule and the calloused mind and the broken feet that kept running. And this is what every tradition that has taken suffering seriously, not as an end in itself, not as something to be sought for its own sake, but as the territory where the most significant human development takes place, has been pointing at since before there was science to describe the mechanism. The question the suffering is asking is not, how much can you take? That is the question it sounds like from the outside, from the comfortable position that looks at the difficulty and sees only the pain and asks, with genuine concern and genuine compassion, why anyone would choose to go there. The question the suffering is actually asking is, who are you on the other side? Not in the sense of after the suffering is over, in the sense of what is produced, architecturally, characterologically, in the deepest layers of what you are, by the specific experience of being in the difficulty and staying, of the first quit arriving and not being the last word, of the limit turning out to be further away than the system believed. The answer is not knowable in advance. That is the point. The answer is only available in the going. Huberman gives you the framework for why going is worth it at the neurological level. Goggins gives you the testimony of someone who went. Both of them are pointing at the door. What is on the other side of the door is yours to find, not by reading about it, not by understanding the mechanism, by going through, past the first quit, into the territory where the map runs out, and discovering in the only way that the discovery is available, through direct, first-person, architecturally embedded experience, that you were always larger than you thought, that the limit was always further than you knew, that the suffering was never asking how much you could take, it was asking who you would become when you found out.